From Chuck Hughes' collapse during a live NFL game that shocked the entire league, to Stone Johnson's tragic injury before his professional career could begin, to Howard Glenn's devastating on-field accident. But watch out for the player whose final moments changed how the NFL responds to medical emergencies forever. Chuck Hughes is the name attached to the darkest single moment in NFL history. The only player who has ever collapsed and died during a live, in-progress NFL game. It happened on a Sunday afternoon in Detroit, in front of a packed stadium with the game clock still running. Hughes was a wide receiver, drafted by the Eagles before he found his way to the Detroit Lions. He played 38 games across 5 seasons in the NFL, catching 15 passes for 262 yards. A journeyman, not a superstar. He wasn't even supposed to be a major factor in this particular game. For the first 3 quarters of the contest against the Chicago Bears, Hughes sat on the sidelines. Then, with about 10 minutes left, he came on to replace a teammate who picked up a minor injury. The Lions were trailing the Bears 28-23 in the 4th quarter, trying to scratch out a comeback. Hughes caught a 32-yard pass, his first catch of the entire season, and was tackled. It looked like nothing. A veteran making a play, getting up, jogging back to the huddle. Then, a few snaps later, with barely a minute left on the clock, he ran a decoy route downfield and started jogging back toward the huddle. That's when he went down. Hughes fell face down to the ground, clutching his chest. He wasn't hit. He wasn't touched. He simply collapsed near the 20-yard line, in the middle of the field, in front of everyone. Chicago linebacker Dick Butkus was the first player to reach him. Butkus immediately signaled to the sidelines for the Lions medical staff. The New York Times reported at the time that Butkus was the first to reach him and called for the Lions doctors from the sidelines. Players from both teams stood frozen. In the Lions locker room, teammates who weren't even on the field yet began to break down. The New York Times noted the news, sent Lions players from the team dressing room in tears, with some muttering that he was already gone. Team doctors sprinted out and began CPR right there on the turf. Bears defensive end Ed Obradovich later described the moment they wheeled Hughes off, saying he knew something was terribly wrong because when they were rolling Chuck off the field, one of his arms fell down and his hand was flopping around back and forth. He said it made him think Hughes might already be dead. And here's the detail that still stuns people 50 years later. The game did not stop. Medical staff worked on Hughes in the ambulance and at the hospital, while the 2 teams played out the final 62 seconds of clock time in front of a stunned, largely silent crowd. There was no thought in 1971 of suspending an NFL game for a medical emergency. Football simply continued. Hughes was pronounced dead a short time later. The autopsy found undiagnosed heart disease, a blood clot that had lodged in a hardened, clogged artery, triggering a fatal heart attack, likely his second cardiac event that day, with the first having gone completely unnoticed. He was 28 years old. His widow, Sharon Hughes, carried that memory for the rest of her life. Decades later, when another player went into cardiac arrest on national television, she stayed up all night, unable to sleep, needing to know that history wasn't about to repeat itself. She'd lived it once already, and she knew exactly what that kind of silence in a stadium sounded like. Hughes remains to this day the only man to die in real time mid-game on an NFL field. But he wasn't the only player this sport has lost. The next name on this list didn't even make it to a regular season snap. Stone Johnson never played a single down in a real NFL game. He didn't need to. His death alone was enough to make the Kansas City Chiefs retire his jersey number forever. Before football, Johnson was an Olympian. He competed as a sprinter in the 1960 Summer Olympics in Rome and had, at one point, held a world record in the 200 meters. He brought that speed to the newly formed Kansas City Chiefs as a kick returner and running back, trying to make the roster during the franchise's very first training camp in Kansas City after relocating from Dallas. It was the preseason of 1963, the Chiefs' final exhibition game before the real season. A matchup against the Houston Oilers played in Wichita, Kansas. Johnson had already fumbled an early kickoff return, setting up an easy score for the Oilers. Teammate Chris Burford later recalled that Johnson was frustrated with himself and determined to make up for it on the next return. On the following kickoff, Johnson lined up as a blocker, sprinting downfield to protect his returner. He dove to make a block on an Oilers lineman, and in doing so, dipped his head just before impact, a technique common at the time, but one the league now recognizes as one of the most dangerous things a player can do. The collision fractured a vertebra in his neck, damaging his spinal cord and paralyzing him instantly. Johnson lay motionless near the 18-yard line. When it became clear something was seriously wrong, teammate Abner Haynes rushed to his side. Johnson told him he couldn't feel his legs, that his career was over before it had really begun, that he'd just been getting started. Then he said something like, "Oh my God," the realization hitting him in real time as he lay on the field. What happened next revealed just how unprepared professional football was for a moment like this. There was no ambulance stationed at the game, and it reportedly took 20 to 30 minutes for emergency services to arrive, a delay that quarterback Len Dawson would remember for the rest of his life. As a symbol of how little the sport had prepared for catastrophic injury, Johnson was eventually rushed to a hospital in Wichita for emergency surgery on the fracture and the spinal damage, but the injury was already catastrophic. He held on for 10 days. His parents were at his side in that Wichita hospital when he finally passed away at just 23 years old. Dawson later said simply that what happened to Stone was tremendously tragic, that he was just getting started. The team never gave out his number 33 again. According to teammates, the number was retired for the same reason another Chiefs number would later be retired, as a permanent marker of a young life cut short on a football field, and a family that had lost a son far too soon. Johnson's death also had ripple effects nobody could quantify. Burford believed Haynes, his childhood friend, was never quite the same player again, and that the entire team's performance sagged under the weight of what they'd witnessed that summer. Johnson's death pushed the Chiefs to make sure an ambulance was present at every game going forward, a small local fix in an era when the NFL had no league-wide safety protocol for catastrophic injury at all. It would take more tragedies, more names, before that started to change. Howard Glenn's story shares an eerie symmetry with Stone Johnson's, another broken neck, another preseason era football league still working out exactly how dangerous this sport could be. Glenn played for the New York team, then known as the Titans, before that franchise became the Jets, in the same rough-and-tumble AFL era that claimed Johnson. Glenn died as a result of a broken vertebra suffered during a game, his neck snapping in a collision on the field, much the same way Johnson's had. Details from that era are thin compared to today's exhaustively documented NFL, largely because the AFL was still a scrappy developing league competing for legitimacy against the more established NFL. Games were played in front of smaller crowds. Medical staff on the sidelines were minimal, and the sport's tackling technique hadn't yet evolved past the head-first hitting style that had also doomed Johnson. What connects Glenn's death to nearly every other name on this list is the era itself. In the early 1960s, football had almost no formal concussion protocol, no spinal injury response training for sideline medical staff, and virtually no mandated equipment standards designed around preventing neck trauma. Helmets were hard-shelled, but offered little protection against the kind of direct, head-down collision that caused fractures like the one that killed Glenn. Players were taught to lead with their heads because that's simply how the technique had always been coached, the same fatal habit that put Stone Johnson on a stretcher in Wichita. Glenn's death, like Johnson's, barely registered outside of football circles at the time. There was no cable news cycle, no viral coverage, no institutional response beyond his own franchise, mourning a player gone far too soon. It's part of why this era of the sport's history is so easy to forget. These deaths happened in relative obscurity, absorbed by a league still fighting for cultural relevance against baseball and boxing, with far less scrutiny than the NFL faces today. But the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Within a few years of both Johnson and Glenn's deaths, the sport would lose yet another young player. This time not to a violent collision, but to something that happened away from a hit entirely, in the sterile setting of a hospital operating room in Kansas City. Mac Lee Hill's death remains one of the strangest entries on this list, because it didn't happen from a hit at all. It happened from what should have been a routine recovery. Hill was a running back for the Kansas City Chiefs, playing in the mid-1960s, in the same franchise that had already lost Stone Johnson just 2 years earlier. Hill died in 1965 following complications from knee surgery, an operation meant to fix an in-season injury and get him back on the field, not end his life. The knee injury itself was the kind of thing NFL players deal with constantly. Ligament damage, cartilage issues, the wear and tear of running behind an offensive line at full speed dozens of times a game. Surgery to repair it was common practice, even in an era when sports medicine looked nothing like it does today. But something went wrong during Hill's procedure, or in the recovery that followed, and the young running back never left the hospital. For a second time in just a couple of seasons, the Chiefs franchise found itself burying a player who should have had a career still ahead of him. It's part of why the number retirement pattern for tragic deaths took hold so early with this specific team. Johnson's number had already been set aside, and Hill's death cemented an unfortunate franchise tradition of permanently honoring players lost before their time. The connection between the two deaths wasn't lost on the people who lived through both of them. Team executives and ownership had, within a few short years, watched two young men die while trying to make it in professional football, one from a violent collision and one from a medical complication nobody saw coming. Hill's death is often overshadowed by the more dramatic, more visible deaths on this list, the ones that happened in front of live crowds or made national news decades later. But it represents a quieter, equally important truth about the risks players face. Sometimes the danger isn't the hit itself, it's everything that happens afterward, in operating rooms and recovery wards, far from the stadium lights. That same year and the years around it, the list kept growing. Down in St. Louis and in Chicago before that, other teams were about to learn the same lesson, that a football locker room could turn into the site of a medical emergency just as easily as the field itself. Stan Malden's death happened in the one place NFL players are supposed to feel safest after the final whistle, the locker room. Malden, a Cardinals player, collapsed there after a game and died shortly afterward, his body finally giving out once the adrenaline of competition had worn off. This pattern, a fatal cardiac event striking not during the game itself, but in the minutes or hours immediately after, shows up again and again across this list. The physical demands of an NFL game don't simply stop the second the clock hits zero. Heart rates stay elevated. Adrenaline is still pumping. And for a player with an undiagnosed cardiac issue, the crash that follows can be just as dangerous as anything that happens on the field. Malden's death predates modern cardiac screening by decades. Today's NFL players undergo extensive physicals, EKGs, and cardiac evaluations before they're ever allowed to suit up. Screening designed specifically to catch the kind of hidden heart conditions that killed players like Malden and, later, Chuck Hughes. In Malden's era, none of that infrastructure existed. A player could have significant underlying cardiac disease and simply never know it until the moment his body reached its absolute limit. This is the same year period where the sport lost another lineman to almost an identical scenario. In 1954, Washington lineman Dave Sparks died as a result of a cardiac event suffered after a game. Sparks had played college ball at South Carolina before starting his NFL career with the San Francisco 49ers, then serving 2 years in the Army before eventually being released in training camp and finding his way to Washington. After a loss to the Cleveland Browns, Sparks went out to dinner with a friend, complaining of chest pains and trouble breathing before his condition rapidly worsened. Like Malden, the true danger wasn't visible until it was already too late. What both of these deaths reveal is a decade of professional football operating with essentially no cardiac safety net. There was no baseline heart testing at the combine, no cardiologist on staff monitoring players with family histories of heart disease, and no real understanding of how the physical trauma of an NFL game could interact with an undiagnosed condition to become fatal. Malden and Sparks were, in a very real sense, ahead of their time in the worst possible way. Early warnings the league wouldn't fully act on for years, until Chuck Hughes' death in front of a national television audience forced a more serious reckoning with cardiac risk in professional football. Even after that reckoning began, though, cardiac deaths didn't stop. The sport would lose at least 2 more players to the same silent threat in the decades that followed. One in a summer training camp, and one in the aftermath of a preseason game that should have ended with nothing more than a few bruises. J.V. Kane's death carries a particularly cruel detail. It happened on his 28th birthday. Kane was a tight end for the St. Louis Cardinals, and he died of a heart attack triggered during a training camp practice on July 22, 1979. Decades before Korey Stringer's name would become synonymous with training camp tragedy. At the time of his death, Kane was described in later reporting as one of only 2 known NFL training camp fatalities on record, alongside Chuck Hughes, whose death 8 years earlier had at least happened during a real nationally broadcast game rather than an unwitnessed practice rep. Kane's death received far less national attention, specifically because it happened away from cameras, in the grind of a summer camp, the kind of session that thousands of NFL fans never see and rarely think about. Practice fatalities like Kane's expose a blind spot in how the public tends to think about football danger. Fans watch games. They see the hits, the injuries, the moments broadcast live to millions of households. But NFL players spend far more hours of their careers in practice than they ever do in an actual game, running the same drills, taking the same reps, pushing through the same conditioning sessions, often with a fraction of the medical staff and cameras present that a Sunday afternoon game would have. Kane's heart attack, like Hughes's and Malden's before him, points to the same underlying gap in 1970s sports medicine: the absence of proactive cardiac screening capable of catching the kind of underlying condition that can turn a routine practice into a fatal event. There was no indication publicly that Kane had any known heart issue before that July morning. He simply collapsed during a workout that thousands of other players across the league were running through at camps of their own that same summer. His death, tragic as it was, didn't trigger the kind of sweeping, immediate policy change that later deaths would. It would take another 22 years and another training camp and a much larger, more public tragedy before the NFL was forced to fundamentally rethink how it manages player safety during the most physically brutal stretch of the season, the dog days of training camp, when players are pushed hardest in the worst possible conditions. Thomas Harion's death has one especially unsettling detail. Cameras were rolling nearby. Teammates were feet away, and still nobody could stop what was happening inside his body. Harion was an offensive lineman for the San Francisco 49ers, a first-year player who had come up through Utah State and spent time on practice squads before finally carving out a roster spot. He collapsed after a preseason game in 2005, and the autopsy later revealed the cause of death was hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, a thickening of the heart muscle that had gone completely undetected up to that point in his young career. The game itself, played against the Denver Broncos, had ended without incident. It was after the final whistle in the tunnel leading back to the locker room that Harion began showing signs of distress. Teammates described a scene of confusion and fear. Defensive lineman Marquez Douglas later said he hadn't seen anything happen, that he simply sat by his locker and prayed for his teammate once word spread through the building. Weather wasn't a factor this time. Reports from that night described conditions in the low 20s Celsius with moderate humidity, nothing close to the brutal heat that had killed another player just 4 years earlier. That detail matters because it underscored something sports cardiologists had been warning about for years. Heart conditions like hypertrophic cardiomyopathy can strike regardless of temperature, regardless of conditioning level, regardless of how well an athlete appears to be performing on a given night. Harion had played an entire preseason game at full NFL speed and contact, with an underlying condition that gave no obvious warning signs until it was fatal. Harion's death came almost exactly 4 years after the training camp tragedy that had already forced the league to start rethinking cardiac and heat-related safety protocols. That earlier tragedy belonged to a Minnesota Vikings lineman whose name would go on to define an entire era of football safety reform: Korey Stringer. Korey Stringer's death is, without question, the single most consequential entry on this entire list. The one that forced the NFL to fundamentally rebuild how it protects players during the most dangerous stretch of the football calendar. Stringer was a Pro Bowl right tackle for the Minnesota Vikings, a massive, talented lineman in the best shape of his career heading into the 2001 season. He died from complications of heat stroke, just the second day of Vikings training camp, on a day when the heat index had climbed above 100 degrees. The warning signs had actually started the day before. Stringer had quietly been pulled off the practice field, apparently already struggling in the brutal heat and humidity, and was taken to an air-conditioned trailer near the field for treatment. It looked at the time like a scare that had been handled. Nobody realized it was a preview of what was coming the very next morning. On that second day, Stringer went through practice again as the heat index reportedly reached as high as 110 degrees. He vomited at least 3 times during the session, but didn't alert a trainer until it was over, a decision teammates would later describe as heartbreakingly typical of the sports culture of pushing through pain. He was one of 6 Vikings players who suffered some form of heat illness that same day. During post-practice work, he slipped while hitting a blocking bag, fell onto his back, and didn't get back up on his own. Teammate Matt Burke was one of the players who immediately called for medical help. Stringer was rushed to the same air-conditioned trailer he'd visited the day before, but this time his condition was catastrophic. By the time he reached the hospital, his core temperature had climbed to 108.8 degrees, and his organs began shutting down one after another. He never regained consciousness. Early the next morning, at not even 28 years old, he died, leaving behind his wife Kelsey and their 3-year-old son. What made Stringer's death so galvanizing wasn't just the tragedy itself, but how preventable experts insisted it had been. Doug Casa, a leading heat illness researcher who would go on to help found the Korey Stringer Institute, later said flatly that the death was completely avoidable. That exertional heat stroke, if caught early and treated correctly, has close to a perfect survival rate. His widow, Kelsey, spent the following 2 decades turning that grief into a mission, pushing the NFL and youth sports organizations across the country to adopt cold water immersion protocols, mandatory hydration breaks, and stricter monitoring during high heat practices. The institutional fallout was significant. Korey Stringer filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the Vikings, which was ultimately blocked by the Minnesota Supreme Court, and a separate suit against the NFL that ended in a settlement in which the league agreed to support the creation of a heat illness prevention program. A related suit against helmet manufacturer Riddell dragged on for years before finally settling as well. Out of all that legal wrangling came something bigger than any single payout. An entire institute bearing Stringer's name that has since helped change hundreds of state-level policies on heat safety in sports at every level, from youth leagues up through the professional ranks. Stringer's death changed training camps forever. Ice tubs, mandatory hydration monitoring, modified practice schedules during extreme heat. All of it traces back to that one morning in Mankato, Minnesota, when a Pro Bowl lineman's body simply couldn't take any more. Every name on this list represents a life that ended. Damar Hamlin's story is different, and it's precisely because of that difference that it belongs at the end of this one. Hamlin was a Buffalo Bills safety, 24 years old, playing in a nationally televised Monday night game against the Cincinnati Bengals. After making a routine tackle on Bengals receiver T. Higgins, he stood up, took a couple of shaky steps, and then collapsed onto his back in front of a stunned stadium and a live television audience of millions. He had gone into full cardiac arrest right there on the field. What happened in the next few minutes looked almost identical to the darkest moments already described in Chuck Hughes' story 50 years earlier. Medical staff sprinting onto the field, players and coaches on both sidelines dropping to their knees, some in tears, some praying. Thousands in the stadium watched as medical workers performed CPR and used an automated external defibrillator to try to restore his heartbeat before he was rushed away by ambulance to a Cincinnati hospital, his mother reportedly riding alongside him. The difference this time was everything that had been built in the decades since Hughes died. A cardiac response team, immediate CPR, an AED on the sideline within seconds. The exact chain of infrastructure that simply hadn't existed in Detroit in 1971 or in Wichita in 1963. And crucially, the decision the league made in the moment. Both teams agreed to suspend the game entirely, and the NFL ultimately called it off for the week rather than force players to finish out the remaining minutes. A decision almost universally seen as the correct one, and one that stood in stark, deliberate contrast to the choice made the night Hughes collapsed, when the final 62 seconds were played out around him. Watching it unfold from her home in Texas was Sharon Hughes, the widow who had lived through the only death this sport has ever seen play out live on the field. She stayed awake deep into that night, needing to know Hamlin would be all right, telling reporters afterward how emotional it made her, how she felt an immediate, painful bond with Hamlin's mother sitting in that ambulance, a bond forged from a fear she recognized instantly. Hamlin survived. He recovered, and he eventually returned to play professional football again, something none of the 10 men whose stories came before his ever had the chance to do. His survival stands as the clearest evidence of exactly how far player safety has traveled since a Detroit stadium fell silent in 1971, since a young Olympian bled out his career on a field in Wichita, since a lineman's body temperature climbed past 108 degrees in a Minnesota summer. But that survival doesn't erase the list that came before it. 10 men, Hughes, Johnson, Glenn, Hill, Malden, Sparks, Kane, Harrion, Stringer, and every name connected to them, took the field and never fully left it. Their deaths, scattered across 7 decades of professional football, are the reason the sport looks anything like it does today. The reason there's an AED on every sideline, a cardiologist at every combine, an ice tub at every training camp, and a league now willing to stop a game entirely rather than play through a medical emergency. Every safety rule that exists in the NFL right now was paid for by one of these names first.